It was a time of darkness and despair. The Israelites had strayed far from God, worshipping idols and living lives of rebellion. And for 7 long years, their punishment came in the form of the Midianites, ruthless invaders who swept through their lands like locusts. They stole crops, slaughtered livestock, and left the people starving and trembling in their caves, but God was not done with his people. He was about to raise a deliverer. And his choice? A young man named Gideon. But Gideon was far from a warrior. He was a simple farmer, threshing wheat in a winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Fear had become his closest companion. One fateful day, as Gideon worked under the scorching sun, he felt something. A presence. The air grew thick, and suddenly, before him stood a man of glowing authority, radiating a heavenly glow. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Judges 6 verse 12, Gideon looked around, eyes wide with disbelief. Was this some cruel joke? A warrior? Him? Surely the stranger was mistaken. "But sir, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about?" Judges 6 verse 13, the man's gaze was unwavering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Judges 6 verse 14. Gideon's heart raced. But doubt clawed at him. "But Lord," Gideon pleaded, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Judges 6 verse 15, the man's voice thundered with certainty, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Judges 6 verse 16. Gideon couldn't shake the doubt clinging to his soul. If this truly was the Lord calling him, then he needed proof. He needed a sign. Something undeniable. That night, as the cool breeze rustled the dry leaves outside his home, Gideon crept into the darkness. With trembling hands, he prepared a young goat and made bread without yeast. He placed them on a rock, offering them before the divine messenger. The angel's eyes glowed with a fierce intensity. And as the staff in his hand touched the offering, fire burst from the rock, consuming the meat and bread in an instant. Then, just as quickly, the angel vanished. Gideon stumbled backward, his heart pounding like a drum. He fell to his knees, his face to the ground. "Ah, sovereign Lord! I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord spoke to him in the silence of his fear. "Peace. Do not be afraid. You are not going to die." Strengthened by the divine encounter, Gideon built an altar and named it "The Lord is Peace." Yet doubt still lingered. He needed more assurance. And so, he made a daring request to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand." Judges 6 verses 36 to 37, the next morning, Gideon found the fleece soaked with dew. But the ground around it was dry. Still not satisfied, he pleaded again, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew." Judges 6 verse 39, and again, God granted his request. The fleece was dry, but the ground around it was soaked. Now Gideon could no longer deny the call. God had chosen him, despite his fear, despite his doubts. Gideon's courage had been awakened, but his journey was far from over. With his faith strengthened by the signs, he blew a trumpet, calling his people to arms. Warriors from the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali responded to the call, gathering around him like leaves blown by a mighty wind. They assembled at the spring of Herat, their spirits high but their numbers frighteningly small compared to the Midianite horde spread across the valley like locusts. But then God spoke to Gideon once again. His word sent chills down Gideon's spine. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own strength has saved me.'" Gideon's hands trembled as he relayed God's command. Those who were afraid were free to leave. And with that, 22,000 men walked away, leaving Gideon with a mere 10,000 soldiers, but God was not finished. There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. At the water's edge, Gideon watched carefully. Most of the men knelt down to drink, plunging their faces into the cool water. But a few brought water to their mouths with their hands, staying alert even as they drank. Separate those who lapped the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. When the test was over, only 300 men remained. They were the ones who drank with their hands, eyes sharp and vigilant. And God's command was clear, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. Gideon's heart raced. From thousands to a mere 300 soldiers against an army too numerous to count. His faith was being stretched to its breaking point. But somehow, he held on. That night, as the campfires flickered and the darkness pressed down, God spoke to Gideon again, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." Gideon's heart pounded as he crept through the darkness, his servant Purah right behind him. Their footsteps were light, their breaths shallow. They approached the outskirts of the Midianite camp, a vast sea of tents sprawling out beneath the night sky. Fires crackled softly, and the faint sounds of snoring and quiet conversations rose like a distant hum. Gideon's courage wavered, but his curiosity kept him moving. And then, just as they approached a tent at the edge of the camp, they overheard two Midianite soldiers speaking. "I had a strange dream last night," one man whispered. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into our camp. It struck the tent with such force that the whole thing overturned and collapsed." The other soldier's voice quivered with fear. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Gideon's eyes widened. His legs nearly gave out from under him. What were the odds that he would hear such words of terror from the enemy's own mouth? He looked at Purah, who was staring at him with the same astonished expression. In that moment, Gideon knew. God's promise was real. Victory was within reach. They crept away from the camp, their hearts beating with newfound courage. And as they returned to their camp, Gideon's voice was steady and strong. "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Gideon's plan was as daring as it was unconventional. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies. Each man was given a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. No swords. No shields. Just instruments of noise and light. Gideon's strategy was simple but terrifyingly brilliant. They would attack in the dead of night, confusing the Midianites into believing their camp was surrounded by a massive army. As the men took their positions around the camp, Gideon's voice rang out. "Watch me," he instructed. "Follow my lead. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon." The air was thick with tension. The 300 men stood ready, their eyes fixed on Gideon, waiting for the signal. And then, in the deepest part of the night, Gideon raised his trumpet to his lips and blew with all his might. The night air was thick with the cold chill of anticipation. Gideon's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what he was about to unleash. He nodded at the men beside him. Their eyes gleamed with a courage that only faith could summon. Then, Gideon raised his trumpet high and blew with all his might. The piercing sound of trumpets shattered the silence, rolling through the valley like a thunderstorm. In perfect unison, the warriors smashed their jars against the ground, the noise like glass rain crashing to the earth. And from the shards, their torches blazed bright, lighting up the night in a sudden, blinding glow. "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," they shouted. Their voices roared into the darkness, echoing across the hills. The Midianite camp was thrown into chaos. Men stumbled from their tents, eyes wild with terror as the noise and lights bombarded their senses. They saw flames surrounding them, their own shadows twisting like demons on the ground. In their panic, the Midianites turned on one another, slashing and hacking with swords meant for the enemy but instead cutting down their own brothers. Screams and shouts filled the air, the madness of fear taking over their minds. Gideon and his 300 men stood their ground, watching as the enemy army tore itself apart. What they were witnessing was nothing short of a miracle. But the victory wasn't yet complete. As the terrified Midianites fled, Gideon's voice cut through the noise. Men of Israel, pursue them. Drive them out from our land. The chase was fierce and relentless. Gideon's forces, now joined by other Israelite tribes, hunted down the remaining Midianites. The enemy was scattered, their power utterly broken. It was over. What Gideon had once thought impossible had become reality. His trembling faith had been replaced with courage. And all of Israel saw that the Lord's power was far greater than any army, no matter how vast. But even in the thrill of victory, a cold chill lingered in the air. Because Gideon had learned something terrifying that night, that true power lies not just in numbers or strength, but in faith and obedience. And it was a lesson he would never forget. The Midianites were completely defeated. Their once mighty army scattered like dry leaves before a storm. Israel was free from their oppression, and Gideon's name spread throughout the land, but the road home was not as peaceful as Gideon had hoped. As he and his men journeyed back, exhausted from battle, they reached the towns of Succos and Peniel. Gideon asked for bread for his weary warriors, but the leaders of those towns refused. Why should we feed you? You haven't even captured the Midia. Why should we feed you? You haven't even captured the Midianite kings yet. They mocked, their eyes gleaming with scorn. Gideon's jaw tightened. He was not a man given to cruelty, but the insult cut deep. Still, he pressed on, determined to complete his mission. And when he finally captured Zebah and Zalmunna, the Midianite kings, he returned to Succos and Peniel to teach them a lesson they would never forget. You doubted the power of the Lord. Now you will see what comes from turning your backs on his people. His judgment was swift and harsh. The leaders of Succos were beaten with thorns and briars, their cries echoing through the hills. The tower of Peniel was torn down, and its men were struck down. Gideon's wrath was not born from pride but from the necessity of showing the people the price of betrayal. Finally, he faced Zebah and Zalmunna. Their eyes were defiant even in chains. What kind of man are you, Gideon, to take vengeance so cruelly? Sneered Zebah, I am the man God chose to free his people. And you are the ones who oppressed us. Gideon's voice was steady, his eyes hard. And with a single strike, he ended their lives. The battle was over. But Gideon's soul was forever changed. The man who had once threshed wheat in fear had become a warrior, a judge, and a leader. But the weight of power was heavy, and Gideon would soon learn that sometimes, the greatest battles are fought within. The people of Israel came to him, their voices raised in praise. Rule over us, Gideon. You and your descendants, for you have saved us from the Midianites. But Gideon shook his head, I will not rule over you. Nor shall my sons rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Judges 8 verse 23, it was a noble answer. But not a perfect one. For Gideon's own actions would sow seeds of trouble. He made an ephod from the gold taken from the enemies. And though he meant it as a symbol of gratitude to God, the people soon began to worship it as an idol. Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years under Gideon's leadership. But the darkness of idolatry was already creeping into their hearts. And when Gideon eventually passed away, the people turned away from God once more. The legacy of Gideon was a mixture of victory and failure, of faith and human weakness. His story was a testament to God's power and the dangerous allure of pride and misplaced devotion, but despite everything, Gideon's name would forever be remembered. Not as a king, but as a reluctant warrior chosen by God to save his people.